Hello and welcome to the Security Operations Lab. This is my first YouTube video. I've done articles on my blog for a couple of years now. You can find the link in the description. I've written and done a lot of things around security operations, threat detection, detection and response, especially when it comes to the Microsoft cloud ecosystem, working in Azure M365, using security tools like Microsoft Sentinel, M365 Defender. Now I thought for this year I would focus a bit more on videos, maybe write some supporting blog articles on the side, but also do more videos. And the first one, this quick video, a bit unscripted, but let's see how it goes. I wanted to talk about using Azure Lighthouse and Microsoft Sentinel together for managing multiple customer environments in the SOC. So we're taking a quick look at Lighthouse. We won't do Lighthouse deployment and configuration. There's a lot of open resources available for you to learn how you actually do Lighthouse configuration. We are looking at how it works, how it looks like. To understand about it, of course, you need to know how it works kind of like behind the scenes. I have one quick picture here just to show you how Lighthouse actually works, and then we'll move over to the Azure portal. So the use case for Lighthouse is that an organization wants to manage multiple Azure tenants, multiple environments where different Azure resources live inside different tenants. And the usual case where I see this is the service provider side, where a security service provider wants to manage, for example, Sentinel for multiple customers. An individual organization could use Lighthouse if they have multiple tenants for some reason, but I very rarely see that in the field. So the way Lighthouse works is that the managing company, or service provider in this case, has a management tenant. So this is a separate Azure AD tenant. They have separate identities, and then all of the customers can be accessed from this single tenant. So for example, the security analyst logs into the management tenant Azure portal with its management identity. And then with that identity, with that principal, they have access to all of the different customers. And the key thing here is that we are talking about Azure services and Azure roles. So you can delegate access to Microsoft Sentinel, for example, because that is an Azure resource. It uses Azure RBAC roles, such as Sentinel Responder. So a security analyst could have Sentinel Responder access to all of the different customers with one user identity, with one login from the management tenant, and from there they can see all of the customers. Lighthouse does not delegate other types of cloud IAM roles. So for example, if the analyst wants to access Azure AD portal or M365, they need something else. And quite often what I see is that the management tenant user identity uses Lighthouse to manage Sentinel, and then it's also invited as a guest user to the customer Azure AD tenant. And that guest user can have Azure AD roles, such as security administrator, and then they can access Azure AD portal to investigate identities, and they can access M365 Defender portal, things like that, but with one identity. So the way this looks like actually in the portal, Lighthouse is not like a visible Azure service here. It just delegates access on the background. What we have here is a management tenant for a fictional company, fictional service provider called SOCvisor. We have a user identity called Analyst1, and this user identity has delegated access to customers through Lighthouse. And if you're going to this for the first time, there's a couple of things you want to check before you actually move to investigate things in Sentinel. And that the point is that you want to make sure that you are seeing all of the customers. And the first thing is the global filter in the Azure portal to make sure that you have selected all of the tenants that you have access to. Otherwise, you won't see them at all. So check the global filter. Then if we move closer to Sentinel, we open the Sentinel page here in Azure Portal. There's another filter that can limit our view. The subscription filter here, make sure that you have selected all of the customer subscriptions, and then you see all of the Sentinel instances that you have access to. In this case, we only have one demo Sentinel for the service provider and one Sentinel for the fictional customer. And the way you can move between these is pretty easy here in the portal. If you select one Sentinel workspace, you get the Sentinel user interface here. You can switch to the other one. This works very close to how it looks like in an individual portal. It's easy to switch. It's easy to look for things. It's easy to open things. There are a couple of limitations here that don't work, but from a security analyst perspective, almost everything works as you would expect. If you were an engineer or an architect, or for some reason doing Sentinel configuration, then you would need to know that managing data connectors that rely on Azure AD roles will not work. So for example, you cannot configure the Azure Active Directory connector because Lighthouse cannot delegate global admin or security admin roles for you. So that won't work. But you can look at incidents, you can search for logs, you can look at automations and workbooks in the customer Sentinel, just like you would do if you would log into the customer tenant itself. So how does Lighthouse benefit us then? This is just Sentinel as usual. Well, there are a couple of key features for Sentinel, for Lighthouse. The one that I most often see used is a unified incidents view. So if we go back to the Microsoft Sentinel front page here on Azure Portal, what we can do is we can select all of the workspaces, all of the customers, and then we have this View Incidents button here. And this gives us a unified view of all of the incidents in all of the customer environments. And this is, of course, good as a single pane of glass for the analyst to see what's happening in different customers, to make sure that things are being responded to check if new things have come up. Investigating things here works almost the same as it works in a normal Sentinel. One thing that you need to understand here, regardless of if you're using the unified view or just looking at one Sentinel instance, is that when we are logged into the management tenant, we can only assign incidents to identities in the management tenant. So we can never see customer users here, and we can't assign incidents to them. Quite often, I think this is a good thing because this allows the SOC to limit the amount of people here in the users list. If a customer tenant has like 10,000 users, managing this can be a bit difficult. But in this case, when we're looking at it from the service provider view, from Lighthouse, we only see the people who actually work in the SOC. So I think that for a lot of service providers, at least, this is a good thing. Since we're here now with an incident that's from M365 Defender, this is a good place to look at how integrating into M365 Defender works from Lighthouse. Like I mentioned, Lighthouse does not allow us to delegate Azure AD roles, which are required for accessing M365 Defender. But in my case, this user identity that I'm using is in the Lighthouse tenant. It uses Lighthouse delegation for Sentinel, but it is also invited as a guest to the customer tenant. And because it's invited as a guest to the customer tenant, we can pivot into things that don't work over Lighthouse. So for example, here, if we click the Investigate in M365 Defender link, it opens a new browser window, and this now works seamlessly because the identity is also invited as a guest. and has the correct Azure AD role to access the M365 Defender portal. So this works seamlessly, but it's using a different method of authenticating. It's using the guest account instead of the Lighthouse account. Another thing that we could see here is if we had an incident that is related to identities, and we don't have all of the data here in Sentinel, and we still want to investigate the group mappings and logins and user properties and things like that. Quite often the security analyst would need to pivot into Azure AD portal from the incident. And of course, if we now go into Azure AD portal here, we are looking at the service provider portal because we are in the management tenant. But once again, since this identity is invited as a guest to the customer tenant, we can go here to the customer tenant Azure AD from here, or the Azure portal. And then when we do this, we can access, for example, Azure Active Directory and investigate things here. So again, a pretty seamless experience when the user identity is also invited as a guest. This is a bit outside of Lighthouse, of course, but from a practical standpoint, this is the way that I see security operations quite often working, is that they access Sentinel with Lighthouse, and then the other things are done with the guest account, because it's very easy to switch, and you only need the one identity on the service provider side to handle everything. Okay, but we can go back to the service provider tenant now. We can go back to Sentinel. We were talking about what extra features or functionalities come to us in Sentinel when we are using Lighthouse. We looked at the unified incidents view, which is, I guess, one of the most valuable things here. There are some other things that you want to be aware of. When you're in the management tenant, you have certain possibilities to investigate and search for things in multiple customers. So for example, you can do log queries from the management side to data that lives in the customer tenants. You could do automations on the service provider side. You could do analytics rules on the service provider side. You can build workbooks on the service provider side. Anything that uses KQL queries can access data that actually lives in different environments. For example, here we are now searching for sign-in logs for this customer, but we are actually in the service provider tenant. And of course, if you can do KQL, you can do all of the things that I mentioned, workbooks, analytics rules, stuff like that. Quite often, I see that this is not used a lot, and for a good reason. There is a performance penalty. There's an extra difficulty for writing the queries. So quite often I see that actually investigating things, searching for logs, things like that, are done in the customer tenant. But of course, it's very easy to switch between these here in Lighthouse or when using Lighthouse. So you can search for data, but quite often it's a better idea to do the searching in the tenant or the workspace where the data actually lives in. Workbooks are a good example of things that the service provider can get a lot of benefit from. So for example, here we have a workbook called Sentinel Central. This is available from the public Sentinel repos. And in here we have a centralized view into different incidents and different data in different customers. And of course, since this is using KQL queries in the background, this might be one of the most common examples of actually doing these kinds of cross-workspace multi-account queries, is to build dashboards for the service provider to show certain limited amounts of data from different customers. That's one common use case for Lighthouse. Another interesting possibility for doing things in a different way from Lighthouse is automation inside Sentinel. It is possible to run automations on both sides. You can have playbooks on the customer tenant and you can have playbooks on the service provider tenant. As long as the Lighthouse delegated access roles contain the permissions to see and run the playbooks, it's possible to use them. It's an important thing for the SOC architects and the engineers to decide where the playbooks should live. So in my experience, running playbooks that actually do response actions inside the customer environments, it's better to have those in the customer tenant, and then maybe on the service provider side have things that are directly related to the way the service provider works, for example, integrating into their service management systems and doing things that actually happen on the service provider side, and then having the other things that actually happen in the customer side, have those on the customer tenant. In some cases, the service provider might consider their automation to be intellectual property. That's another reason to have them on the service provider side. But from a functional standpoint, my experience is that it's better to run the automation where the activities are actually expected to happen. But I don't have a lot of automations here in the lab at the moment, but if we go into the customer tenant and we, for example, we select an incident and then we go into the run playbook page in Sentinel, we can see that this is possible. There is one automation playbook on the service provider side. I am able to run it here while I am actually in the customer Sentinel experience. So just to kind of like show you that it's possible, you can have automations on both sides of the table, and you need to decide where it's better to run them. So I guess that's about like the main points of the user experience in Azure Lighthouse for people working in Sentinel. The main points being that we have the unified incident view. We can access incidents in different customers. If we move over to services that don't rely on Azure RBAC roles, then we need to have either a separate identity or a guest identity in the customer tenant to make that happen. If we have a guest identity, it's a pretty seamless experience to jump between different portals. So the unified incident view, accessing different customer Azure AD portals and M365 portals from incidents is one thing. The other thing, of course, being the ease of switching between different environments. I only have 2 Sentinels here, but if I had 10 customers, it would be a lot easier to switch here inside the management tenant's Azure portal instead of logging individually into all of the customer portals. So accessing the basic Sentinel UI is very easy to see things in different customers when using Lighthouse. And then we can also, if we are working on the management side, if we have selected the management side's workspace, we can search for things. We can search for data in the customer workspaces when using these cross-workspace KQL queries. If there's a good use case, you can use that. If there's a good use case for workbooks, dashboarding on the service provider side, you can also use that. If there's a good use case for having automations on the service provider side, you can run those. But also always be mindful of where it's better to run certain things. Search for data where the data actually lives. Do automations where the activities are actually expected to happen. And if there are some reasons that you must take it over to the service provider side, like protecting your IP or things like that, then you need to do careful planning on how you actually are going to write the analytics rules, for example, if you expect them to work in the customer tenant. Now that I remembered that, a quick word of those. You can only do scheduled rules from the management side. So all of the Fusion rules and all of the Microsoft first-party analytics rules, they will always have to be run on the customer tenant. So you always have to enable those rules in the customer tenant. And for everything else too, in my experience, it's better to do things inside the customer unless there are like real reasons to insource it to the service provider tenant. But I guess that's about it. This was a pretty quick video, a bit kind of like unscripted, but hopefully this gave you a quick overview on how Sentinel looks like for a security analyst when using Lighthouse delegations to access multiple customers. And I have a couple of interesting new video ideas coming up for this winter. So hang around and follow the channel and let's see what we can come up with.